thanks, Chris, for that very kind introduction. So my talk today, again, is called, Was It Really So? Royal Uncle's Notions of Authenticity in the Reception, Redaction, and Reconstruction of Some Avuncular Remonstrations. So I've started this talk with this picture of a hole somewhere in South Central China, allegedly, according to the website that I downloaded this from. This is a grave robber's hole, and as the story goes, within this tomb was found the corpse of a grave robber, along with a number of artifacts. I've looked at the excavation reports for the site claimed in this, and I've been unable to confirm it. But in many ways, this hole represents a lot of different aspects of what I'm going to talk about today, in the sense of missingness of texts, they're being lost or forgotten, perhaps removed. Also in the sense that some of the texts that I'm working on may have come from a hole that looks much like this. And we should have some trepidation about the pitfalls of studying these manuscripts that are on provenance. So in this particular case of the Renyun Fu manuscript that I'll talk about, it was apparently removed by grave robbers. This apocryphal story also represents a possible fate that I contemplate when I begin to try to wrap my head around the topic of the reception, history, and transmission of Shu documents. Shu documents, I'm going to talk a little bit more. Shu documents are historical documents, most sort of paradigmatically from the Western Zhou dynasty, so around 1000 BC. Their textual history is extremely complicated. It's filled with controversies and pitfalls. This major debate, a long-standing debate, is about two recensions, a Guwen and a Jinwen recension of one particular compilation, the Shangshu, the esteemed documents, allegedly compiled by Confucius. And there is also another collection called the Yizhou Shu, which we can translate either as lost documents or leftover documents, that, in contrast, for much of interpretive history, has languished as the leftovers that remain when Confucius compiled the Shangshu. So what I want to do today, perhaps the most concrete thing I'm going to do, in addition to sort of discussing doing some general introductions of the Shu documents and problems, is to contextualize two of these leftover documents, so two texts of the Yizhou Shu, within a larger history of reception and compilation. Both of these chapters depict senior nobles that are exhorting or remonstrating against their ruler. They're critical texts, and both are also related to texts that are found in this recently obtained cache of manuscripts that's held by Tsinghua University. They're related in some way or another, in different ways, which I'll go into more detail about. The two texts, the chapters of the Yizhou Shu, are the Renyun Fu chapter and the Jaigong chapter. So Renyun Fu, Good Man of Rei, is his name, and Jaigong, Duke Jai. So just to give an overview, I'm going to talk a bit about Shu documents and their compilation, and then I'm going to give a somewhat non-linear history of textual criticism, reception, classification of Shu documents, discuss the senses of authenticity that we could apply to Shu in reception history. And then I'm going to talk in some more detail about case studies, these two texts that I just mentioned, and also some of the methodological problems of reconstructing and dating one of these texts, the Renyun Fu, which is available only in its sort of transmitted versions. We're going to make some speculations about why these chapters are left over and talk about a model for recomposition of history. So just to start, to answer the question of what are Shu, I want to give a non-exhaustive outline of some possible definitions. So one of these are just writings, things worth writing down, or Shu actually means to write in some contexts, the verb to write. It also means documents that could be historical ones, perhaps those left behind by Western Zhou archivists. Could also refer to a document's genre of writing that includes the sort of thing that Zhou archivists might have kept, or imitations of such texts. We could say that maybe Shu is a supergenre of documents that includes various subgenres of texts or genres of texts subordinate to this supergenre. Consultations, instructions, announcements, declarations, commands. But with the archaic Gao chapters as a paradigm. So there's a group of chapters. All of these, I should say, are speeches. They're, for the most part, royal speeches, speeches of royals and nobles. And the ones in the most archaic language that relate to events of the Western Zhou, or relate events of the Western Zhou, speeches of the Western Zhou, are these archaic Gao chapters that may be or are viewed as the earliest layer of the Shangshu. Shu could also be, and is, a set of textual repertories that contain documents, as I've mentioned above. They're foundational texts of political philosophy in China. So their interpretive history is very disputed, continuous, and long. Shu could also refer to, at least traditionally refers to, a bounded canon of 100 select texts compiled by Confucius that are a template, a moral template, a political template of sorts. And then, of course, it's a compilation, as I've mentioned, with an extremely complex and confusing textual history. So we've got the Jinwen and Guwen texts of the Shangshu and the Izhou Shu. And then things that we don't quite know what they are yet. The Shangshu, as we have it, or as we may have had it at one time, consists of 45 documents divided into 58 chapters of a presumed 100. And of those, the Jinwen, which I'll talk about a little more in just a second, there are 28 or 29. The Guwen texts, as we have them, include those same chapters or those same documents plus an additional 16 that were lost, then found, then lost again, then rediscovered, and possibly forged or recreated in medieval times. So the currently extant Guwen chapters are viewed as forgeries, and the Kongangguo preface that accompanies those, which I'll talk about briefly, or I'll talk about Kongangguo briefly, names 100 chapters total. The other compilation, the Izhou Shu, was originally, or at least in the earliest bibliographic letters, or bibliographic records, is in 70 chapters with one preface, excuse me. And they consist of a relatively homogeneous core, so texts that look very similar to each other. And then there's some other heterogeneous materials in there. But if we take that, excuse me, if we take that 71 and we add it to the 29 of the Jinwen, then we also get 100. So there's some question of what the purpose of or what the numerology of these translation histories are. And I'm not going to answer that, but that's one question. So I want to say a few things about some of the most important discoveries of Shu documents. And this is probably not going to be completely exhaustive. But one very famous event in Chinese history is this Qin Dynasty bibliocost, so the burning of the books and the killing of entombing of scholars. And according to this story, an academician named Fu Sheng hides his Shu documents in a wall. And then later in the Western Han, those are excavated and only 28 of them are legible. And since Fu Sheng had written these down during the Qin Dynasty or immediately before the Qin Dynasty, these are written in a standard state of Qin or empire of Qin script, so in a Lishu clerical script. And that's what we call the Jinwen Shangshu. So these are later canonized in the Han. Around the time they're canonized, in a separate discovery of a Taisha, and then some other some other discoveries also happen around this time. It's not clear what they are. The Taisha also from a wall, which, as you'll see, we begin to wonder whether the wall is a trope or whether these all were really truly in walls. Some have argued that Fusheng would not have actually needed to hide Xu in his wall. But I won't go into that in detail. The next major discovery is in the late 2nd century BC, this tadpole script, or archaic pre-Qin script, Guan version of the documents that was allegedly found in the wall of Confucius's ancestral home during some renovations. And these, as far as we know, had homologs of 28 Jinwen chapters that we know already, a new version, yet another version of the Taishi chapter, and 16 additional previously lost chapters. And this, it seems, was again lost. There's not a lot of traces of the actual Guan Shangshu that is referred to in this particular narrative. However, something, and so this actually, I should say also that this Guan Shangshu became attached with a commentary by Kong Anguo, who was a direct descendant of Confucius. And this thing was lost. There are very few traces of it until someone named Meiza presents this to the Jin court. And then later, Song scholars noticed that it is particularly the chapters that are exclusively found in the Guan chapter are easier to read than those in the Jinwen chapter. Qing scholars have used various methods, philological methods, to show that it is a quote-unquote forgery that is reconstructed from extant quotations. And that is the view now. And in some ways, if we believe the Qinghua manuscripts are real, then they should put an end to that. But again, there are problems of authentication of those as well. So another part of this history of rediscovery that may not actually relate directly to Shu documents is a discovery made in Ji Commandery in around 280 CE from something that is called the Jaigong grave there. It contained various texts, including some we still have now that have been transmitted from that time, including the Bamboo Annals and the Mu Tianzi Zhuan, which is a story of King Mu. And then also something that is called a Zhou-shu. And we don't know exactly what that means, but it became associated, perhaps wrongly conflated, with the Izhou-shu, so with the leftover documents. And then a modern piece of this history of sort of rediscoveries is the 2008 Xinhua discovery. And these contain, as I believe I've mentioned, things that are found in the Shangshu, things that are found in the Izhou-shu, and things for which there are forged versions found in the Shangshu, possibly. So, so maybe these are authentic versions of previously forged texts. But what do we mean when we say authentic? So this is just maybe to help our later discussion, but I just want to lay out some senses of authenticity that we can consider when thinking about these. Texts, I think, are very different from paintings or art objects in that they're copied. So that's one major point of difference. We're not always as concerned with the particular object, of course. In some cases with manuscripts, we are. So, but in terms of reception, history, authenticity as authorship, so are these texts the direct speech of their putative proto-authors? So with the Gao chapters as a paradigm, are these actual contemporary records of direct speech that have been recorded and archived and transmitted? Another concept of authenticity that we'll encounter briefly in a few minutes is this idea of historical veracity. So are they authentic in that the historical events that they describe are real, or do they portray historical events accurately? Are they authentic in being morally exemplary? So this is also a sort of a point at which authenticity in the two senses I've discussed gets kind of mixed with moral judgment or critical, sort of text critical judgments. Authenticity as a provenance in some Western Zhou archive, another possibility. And then another very important one that we'll encounter in some detail later is this idea of editor as author, editoricity, if we can make up a word here, conferred, for example, by the act of Confucius's alleged editing of the documents, which also has implications for the moral exemplarity of the documents. Another thing, in the sense that we might be concerned with today in the age of scientific archaeology, that is still the age of textual forgery and grave robbery, is authenticity as verifiable antiquity. So something that might be claimed or doubted in the case of the Tsinghua manuscripts, but also in the case of the other sort of now inaccessible stories of manuscript discovery of the past. So maybe we could call that archaeological authenticity. And then authenticity, as I've alluded to in the case of some of the Tsinghua texts, authenticity defined in contrast to something that has been already proved to be falsified or shown to be inauthentic in some way, or a forgery, for example. And then there's the matter of creator's intent. So is something that seeks to recreate an authentic original, is that authentic in itself? Is authenticity transmissible in some of these cases? So what I'd like to talk about next is the first doubts about authenticity and start from the beginning. And we'll move towards a discussion of the authenticity of the Yizhou Shu. But this is certainly related to that. Excuse me. So the earliest expression we have about the authenticity in any of the senses that I've mentioned above about a Shu document comes in the Mencius. And Mencius says, to believe everything in the Shu is worse than there being no Shu. In Wuchang, one of these Shu documents, I accept only 2 or 3 slips of the whole pian. So two or three bamboo slips of the whole bamboo slip that was tied together. The benevolent man is without rival in the realm. When the most benevolent campaigns against the most malevolent, how could rivers of blood have swept up the staves? And so what he's referring to here is the story of the Zhou conquest and the idea that apparently was the idea that the Zhou conquest would be a bloody event. So in Mencius's mind, because the Zhou founders were benevolent people, the historical veracity of a violent conquest needs to be called into question. So this statement of doubt about the historical veracity based on a certain moral orientation or certain kind of faith about the moral orientation of the Zhou rulers is not in itself a text critical statement, but it's a judgment about the veracity of Shu documents, and it has clear implications about the need to read critically, the gradations of value that a Shu text might have in a doctrinal setting or in a school. So we wonder, in this particular case, the Shifu chapter, is the Shifu chapter of the Izhou Shu really the Wucheng chapter that was in the Shangshu? Gu Jaigong has made this argument. And Ed Shaughnessy in 1980 made the argument more clearly that this could be the result of a redaction based on Mencius's doubts. So Mencius expresses these doubts. They are sort of not text critical in a Han sense, but like later in the empire, it could actually give rise to a redaction event, or an event in which a text in one canon, the esteemed canon, gets moved to the leftover canon. Can we discern patterns whereby the content of a text might have predisposed it to be compiled in the esteemed Shangshu as opposed to the leftover Izhou Shu? So the part of the research project that I've really, that is original here, I think, is about this question and the sort of compilation practices in the creation of the Izhou Shu. And I'll go into some more detail about that. But this is one of the questions: is what is the nature of text criticism in these early times? So I'm just going to give a summary of these two chapters that I've mentioned in the Izhou Shu, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about Izhou Shu transmission, and I'll move on to a comparison of these in some more detail. But so one of these is one of these chapters is the Jaigong chapter, and perhaps it is like the Wucheng chapter that should be esteemed, but is left over as a result of compilation practices. And this is a question. So in this text, Jaigong Mofu addresses King Mu, who I mentioned earlier in the Mu Tianzi Zhuan. He's sort of this first kind of wayward, slightly wayward king, the beginning of the decline of the Zhou, perhaps, the first guy who needs any kind of remonstration among the early Zhou rulers. And in this text, which is, I should say, to be fair, it's not strictly just a remonstration. It is lots and lots of exhortations, and then one passage, which I'll list below, that seems to be remonstratory. So in this, the elder Jaigong remonstrates against King Mu, who's known for his extended military campaigns against the Chenrong and his perhaps illicit relations with Chongji. And these are things, the latter is, shows up in the Mu Tianzi Zhuan in some detail. In any case, as the story goes, his favored concubine dies. This sends King Mu into depression, and that sets the background for Jaigong's speech, which is admonitory. He says, and this is the translation of Ed Shaughnessy here, you ought not use perversity, transgression, guilt, or pain to lose the great results of these two kings, referring to Wen and Wu, the founders of the Zhou. You ought not, because of favored consorts, embitter the stately queen. You ought not, because of small plans, defeat great undertakings. You ought not, because of favored relations, pain the stately great officers and ministers. You ought not, because of family, disorder the king's house, and not be sympathetic to those outside it. So it's exhortations, but they're all framed in the negative. And moreover, they're all talking about things that King Mu has presumably already done. So in that sense, this seems quite critical. And it's certainly more critical than anything that we see in the Shangshu that is set in a Zhou context, with the Zhou ruler being remonstrated against. And so a version of this text called the Jaigong Zhiguming is found in the Tsinghua corpus. Let's see. Oh, sorry. The second of these is called Renyun Fu. And in this one, this is also in the Izhou Shu. In this one, Renyun Fu, the good man of Rei, addresses King Li, and King Li represents really the beginning of the end of the Western Zhou, and he's known for malfeasance and negligence. And so we don't see that in this particular text, but he is criticized for making Gong his prime minister. However, in general, his employment of unworthy ministers shows up in a lot of sources about Renyun Fu. And I'm just going to read you an excerpt from this. Renyun Fu said to the effect, "Woho, it is you, son of heaven, who inherits the legacy of Kings Wen and Wu. It is you, officers and noble sons, who hold the same offices as the ministers of former kings, who go about muddled and gazing inward, leading the king improperly, monopolizing resources and creating tyranny, aiding chaos and abetting misfortune. The men will not stand for it, or the people will not stand for it in this case." One distinction between this and the previous one I read you is that in the previous, in the Jaigong chapter, the passage I read you is really the extent of what I would call a critical statement, whereas in this one, the whole thing is critical. So if we read this in a sort of historical sequence, then we can see the decline of the Zhou as reflected in these documents. This text does not have a homologue in the Tsinghua corpus, but there is another text called the Renyun Fu Bi, which is very similar to this in many ways. It does not share any text, but it shares almost all the same ideas, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I want to talk really about generally this question of being lost or left over, because it's often translated now as leftover documents, the Yizhou Shu. The first clear usage of this term Yizhou Shu to refer to this compilation occurs in the Shuowen, so in Xushan's Shuowen Jiezi. These are philological sources, character charts. The Erya, Guopu's notes the Erya also use this term Yizhou Shu, but there's no clear, as far as I can tell, there's no clear judgment associated with this with lost or leftoverness. It's merely lost books of Zhou, and indeed this term also gets used for the 16 chapters of the Shangshu, the esteemed documents, that differed from the 28 Jinwen chapters and were regarded as lost in that particular context. So in this context, Yizhou Shu seems to differentiate a collection from the Shangshu, but it's not clear what the judgment is. The earliest record that we have is the Hanshu Yuanzhi. It lists the Zhou Shu, which is what this was generally called for most of transmission history, alongside the Shangshu and Shangshu commentaries. So in the Yuanzhi, we see that we have a Zhou Shu in 71 Pian scrolls, and these are historical records of the Zhou. And then we have nothing clear of a critical nature until the beginning of the Tang, when the Hanshu was the subject of a huge amount of commentary. And Yan Shigu says, Liu Xiang comments, so he's quoting someone, he's quoting Liu Xiang from the Western Han. Liu Xiang says, these are proclamations, oaths, and commands from Zhou times, must be the rest or leftovers of Confucius's 100 Shu documents. 45 chapters are currently extant. The problem is, the source from which Yan Shigu quoted this is no longer available. So we don't know exactly which part is Yan Shigu talking and which part is Liu Xiang talking. So when he says 45 chapters are currently extant, that may still be Liu Xiang talking, but it's not clear. When he says must be the rest or leftovers of Confucius's 100 Shu documents, that might also be Yan Shigu talking, but it's not really clear. But somewhere in here, there is a change in the reception history, or at least a clear statement about what the Yizhou Shu is presumed to be. So here are some other, here are some other bibliographies that treat the Zhou Shu as it's called during this time. I should probably have said at the outset, when I say Izhou Shu, this is, of course, a name for this compilation that has a precedent in the works of Shushan and the Shuo and Jiezi and in Guopu, but it really becomes used more commonly in the Qing dynasty. So, and we use that today to refer to this. But in these early bibliographies, the Izhou Shu is just referred to as the Zhou Shu. So in the Sui Shu, so compiled early in the Tang, this one says it has a Zhou Shu and Tianjuan documents from Jizhong. So now it adds this, it adds this Jizhong association. It appears to be the remnants from Confucius's Shu redaction. So this is consistent with what we see in Yan Shigu. The Zhou Tang Shu names a slightly different text, an 8-dren with a Kongzhao commentary, a Kongchao commentary. We don't know much about him. However, we do know that this text must have been available before then. And in fact, I'll talk about that a little bit later when I come back to the Sui Shu and the compilation of that particular one, and the compilation of a different text called the Qunshu Jiao. So I'll come back to that. The Xintang Shu, we see it's now called the Jizhong Zhou Shu in Tianjuan, but it also circulates with something that's just called the Zhou Shu. So this Jizhong has now become attached to the name of the compilation. And I suspect there are several reasons for this. Probably one of them is that much as Shushan needed to differentiate the Izhou Shu from the Zhou Shu, which is used to refer to the Zhou era documents of the Shang Shu, there is now, along with the Sui Shu and a number of other pre-Tang dynasties during the Tang, a number of histories were commissioned, including one history. We see that now this comment about the...
David, sorry to interrupt. Would you mind just going back maybe like a sentence or two? I think you, maybe it was on my end alone, but the audio kind of froze for a bit.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so
it could just be on my end, so apologies if so.
No, let me, okay, I will repeat that. Hopefully hearing me read the bibliographies of every dynasty will not put everyone completely to sleep. But in any case, so if in case we missed it, did I tell you about the Sui Shu? I'm not sure. Did you hear that one, Chris?
Yeah, most of the Sui Shu. Yeah, we got into the, yeah.
Okay, so that appears to be the remnants of the Zhou Shu, and it's consistent with what Yan Shigu says. The Zhou Tang Shu has a Zhou Shu in 8-dren and with a Kongzhao commentary. And we know that the Kongzhao commentary existed before this for reasons that I'll discuss later. And the Xintang Shu has 2 texts, one that has been named the Jizhong Zhou Shu, and one that is called the Kongzhao commentary, excuse me, Zhou Shu, in 10 and 8-dren respectively. And I will repeat again, hopefully not for everybody, that the name Zhou Shu here, or the name Jizhong Zhou Shu, may be to differentiate this text from the history of the Beizhou, so the northern Zhou dynasty, that is also called the Zhou Shu, and that was commissioned along with the Sui Shu and a number of other pre-Tang histories. By the time we get to the Song dynasty, this story about the discovery of the Jizhong documents is now elaborated. So even though there's not very good evidence, none of the text that we have from Jizhong seems to correspond to what is found in the current Izhou Shu, as far as I know. So there is, however, this story that I've been telling you that implies that Yan Shigu made this up and that this is a Tang judgment about the leftoverness. There is one account in the Liangshu, which is a history that was made around the same time as the Sui Shu, but actually seems to incorporate slightly earlier materials. And it was not a royally commissioned history, but it was sort of a father and son, sort of like the Simas in the Han Dynasty. But in any case, this particular excerpt of the Liangshu is talking about this guy, Liu Xian, who is brilliant and knows the textual history cold. And this anecdote is meant to illustrate that. It tells the story of this guy, Ren Fang. Ren Fang once obtained a missing scroll of bamboo slips, from which much of the writing was fragmentary. He showed it repeatedly to others, but nobody could recognize it, except when Liu Xian saw it. He said the scroll was redacted and lost from ancient script documents from the Guanshong Shu. And Ren Fang examined the Zhoushu, so what we've been calling the Yizhou, and found that it was indeed as Liu had said. So this basically tells a story that the things that are in what we call the Zhoushu are what Liu Xian has called Guanshong Shu Suo Shan Yi Pian. So if we assume this refers to Confucius, then it's a little bit hard to interpret because, of course, the Shangshu, and I should mention, the Shangshu was not actually called the Shangshu until after Confucius. So for Confucius, these were just the Shu. The Shangshu is something that gets used later to refer to Confucius's alleged compilation. So are these the things from the Guan Shangshu that were removed? Like, for example, the possibility that the Wucheng chapter could be removed, or were they things removed from an earlier Guan Shangshu, like that discovered by Kong Anguo? Or are these just talking about ancient texts, documents written in ancient scripts that were not necessarily accepted? And does "I" in this context mean the same as Shan? Maybe it does, and it's not entirely clear. I think this is a very interesting story, but in any case, sometime we can say with some certainty that somewhere in this period between Liu Xin and Yan Shigu, these become viewed as leftovers, and the sort of the story of Confucius getting rid of these things becomes more accepted. And I should also mention, I forgot to mention this before, is that in all those bibliographies after the Han, these get put in the Zashe, the assorted histories section. So they are no longer in the section with the Confucian canon. Now that is actually not the case for one other text that I will talk about in a few minutes. But in any case, this is the beginning of the decay for the Yizhou, although it maybe is not a matter of consensus in the early time. And I don't think the Jaigong association helps. So I want to drink some water and then fast forward to modernity and come to sort of reevaluations of what is left over and what is to be esteemed. And in modernity, or the beginnings of modernity, we have in the Qing dynasty 2 scholars named Zhuang Shuzu and Wei Yuan. And Zhuang Shuzu identified both the chapters that I am primarily talking about today, the Jaigong and the Renyun Fu chapters, as part of a group of chapters in the Yizhou that are allegedly lost chapters of the Shangshu. So he says these things are actually, they're supposed to be in the esteemed documents. They are real Shangshu documents, but they are instead in the Yizhou. And Huang Peirong, who wrote a very important dissertation on this in 1975, said that this was spectacularly unreliable, probably for a lot of other reasons, just the style, philological style, or the ability that Zhuangzi has to support some of these ideas. Another scholar named Wei Yuan, also in the Qing dynasty, said that the Jaigong and the Renyun Fu are lost Shu chapters as well, and he called these part of the Muang Shu. So perhaps I have more research to do on this, but as far as I know, this is it's associated perhaps with this Jaigong idea, but then certainly with the idea that these are critical texts that begin with Muang. Huang Peirong says this guy is also wrong. So the question is this: do we have something called the Shangshu and something called the Yizhou Shu that are sort of, are we putting these together unnecessarily? Is textual criticism, this is sort of what Huang Peirong is criticizing and saying, well, you can't do that. These are compilations that are sort of established. In the age of archaeology and grave robbery, in light of the Qinghua manuscripts, we might think of these things differently. Li Shuqian, at least, has claimed that there's no obvious distinction in the context of the manuscript cache between Shangshu texts and Yizhou Shu texts, and that the lack of distinction may, in fact, be representative of the pre-Han interpretive and doctrinal environment. But then again, we have this kind of lacuna, or we have this problem with the authentication of the Qinghua manuscripts themselves. It could also be claimed that there is really no context. These are decontextualized texts. That's all true. But if they are a corpus that is cohesive in some way, then there is, Li's argument is persuasive in some ways. So at least for those of us that are concerned with intellectual history, do we follow the linguistic features of transmitted text, or do we rely on unprovenanced manuscripts? These are questions that we have to face when we want to know about the development of ideas, so that as are evidenced by these texts themselves. And the traditional way of doing this has been by sort of traditional textual philology and linguistic analysis. So we're kind of stuck here. Do we, in this particular case, when we read these texts together, do we follow Huang Peirong? Can we continue to do these linguistic studies, or do we rely on manuscripts that are not provenanced to reconstruct intellectual history? Maybe there are ways of authenticating them in other ways. But in any case, to come back to this idea of the Jaigong and Renyun Fu chapters having some kind of affinity, crazy as they may have been, when we look at other scholars that have grouped texts of the Yizhou Shu, these always show up together in almost every case as either being lost chapters of the Shangshu, lost books of King Mu, in the cart tracks of the Shangshu, earlier than the core of the Yizhou Shu, which is a more sort of cohesive set of documents that appear to be later. Or are they, they've also been called Western Zhou texts, or the oldest texts related to the Shangshu. Various ways of calling these, they almost always get grouped together. So just to say a little more about these two texts in particular, they have a certain number of things in common that these interpreters, including Zhuang Shuzu and Wei Yuan, recognize. Both of the chapters depict in some way remonstrations of Zhou rulers. Both Jaigong and Renyun Fu are named as authors of remonstratory poems in early commentaries. So Renyun Fu, the Sangro, this poem is attributed to Renyun Fu in the Shijing. A poem called Qi Zhao is quoted in the Zhuozhuan, where it's attributed to Jaigong. Both of these are sort of admonitory poems, which, for much of history, that's how you do admonition of the Zhou rulers, is you write a poem. Both of these can be reconstructed with new sources. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this. I've already mentioned that there is another version of the Jaigong text. There is actually another version of the Renyun Fu text that is preserved in a text called the Chunshu Jiao, the governing essentials of the flock of books, or something like that. And this was lost sometime in the Song Dynasty, where it was preserved only in Japanese manuscripts, and in the Qing it returned to China. And the actual Japanese manuscripts were published, I think, in 1989, finally. So both of these texts have closely related texts in Qinhuajin, which I've mentioned, and both are still difficult to come up with a final date on. They differ in certain ways. So the Jaigong and the Jaigong Zhiguming are versions of the same text. And since that is the case, if we want to date them in some ways, the terminus antiquem is the entombing of the Qinghua texts. But then again, of course, we have this authentication problem. With the Renyun Fu text, it's a little bit more complicated. They are two different sources. The Renyun Fu B in the Qinghua manuscript and the Renyun Fu chapter of the Izhou Shu are sources of a similar narrative. They relate almost an identical narrative, like two unrelated accounts of a silent film, one of which is a musical and one which is not, in that sense. They're that formulaic with regard to the sort of history they relate. But the Renyun Fu B does not help date the Renyun Fu chapter of the Izhou Shu in any way. So these also differ in regard to their intertextual sharing. So the Jaigong is very formulaic. There's some 15 places in which the text echoes other early texts, especially other Shu documents. And the Renyun Fu seems to not really have any sharing with any other text. There's one questionable citation in the Wuxi Chunshu. It's not very identical. How do these texts differ with regard to the nature of their critique, which I've mentioned? One addresses the ministers, other is direct speech to the king, but the criticisms are not as explicit unless you know the history of King Mu. They differ with regard to style and prosody. So the Jaigong is a very archaic style, difficult to read, does not rhyme. The Renyun Fu is somewhat less archaic and it rhymes loosely and is difficult. It's very difficult to read because it is corrupt. And I'm going to talk a little bit less about the Jaigong text and more about the Renyun Fu. So they differ in that way too. But what I want to talk about here is reconstructing the Renyun Fu from this other Lei Shu, the Chunshu Jiao, governing essentials from the flock of books. So if we remember, the Sui Shu, which I mentioned, was the first place where the Izhou Shu gets listed as a zashi, as an assorted history. So it's no longer a canonical. The Izhou Shu is at that point no longer canonical. It starts to be viewed, as Yan Shigu did it, as the leftovers. But and that text, interestingly, is attributed to Wei Zheng, whose name I'm afraid I've written twice here. Wei Zheng to the Tang Taizong Emperor in 631. But Wei Zheng did not actually finish it, and he did not finish the bibliographic treatises. And what's interesting is that in the Chunshu Jiao, the organization of textual excerpts is different from that in the Sui Shu bibliography, in that it has a classics, histories, masters bibliographic organization scheme, in which its excerpts from the Joshu, from the Izhou Shu, go into the classics section. So this is different from what we find in the Sui Shu and everything afterwards. And this contains excerpts from several texts in the Izhou Shu, the Wenzhuan, the Guanren chapters, but it presents almost the entirety of Renyun Fu. And so actually Wei Zheng, I think, was, he held a Jiani Dafu title, I believe at some point, was in charge of remonstrations. So it seems fitting that he would choose the entirety of the Renyun Fu chapter in some sense, but it's implicit that this is in some way morally exemplary because he does that, or maybe he had some other reason. But in any case, even though the Kongjiao commentary was not listed in the Suishu bibliography, the Chunshu Jiao version of the text also contains the Kongjiao commentary. So it was probably made from a different text than they had when they did this Suishu bibliography. I've mentioned that both of these seem to derive from the same text. But if we look carefully, and this is sort of the heavy lifting of the paper in some ways, when I have compared these very carefully and tried to reconstruct a translated version of this chapter from these two sources, we find that there is a lot of stuff missing from both of these texts. And so they have suffered. And this is what happens, I would argue, when we remove Confucius as an authenticating compiler figure or an authenticating editor figure. So decay, neglect, and corruption are what we get. So if we want to answer the questions I've mentioned before about whether the Jiushu is old, we can look at the differences between these two versions of the text and see, okay, is it possible to use linguistic features to make to make judgments about the dating of the text? There are archaisms in both versions. The language is archaic. We use si wei as the copula. The modal chi is used throughout. So these are features of sort of pre-classical Chinese. On the other hand, there's some inconsistencies in how some other particles are used. For example, qi and zhu are both used as pronouns. One uses fu and one uses bu, one uses you and one uses you. These are changes that must have occurred. And these are changes, I should say, that are often used in order to, or have traditionally been used in order to judge the date of the text. So by what types of particles are used. But these texts, which seem to have diverged somewhere in the Tang Dynasty, use different versions of these particles. So it makes it very difficult to say that we can say anything definitive on the basis of these types of linguistic features. If we look at other features, prosody, I would say that this Renyun Fu chapter is most similar in prosody to a speech in the Panggong chapter, but then that is a relative dating. We see rhyming in the later Yijiushu core chapters, but not generally in the Guan only Shangshu, like early Gao chapters and that sort of thing. So in terms of intertextuality, there is not very much to speak of, although we can ask, what its relationship is to the Qinghua text. Is one reconstructing the other? And I'll come back to this. And then there's some idiosyncrasies that we just don't really see in other texts. For example, Reibo Ruo Yue is Wang Ruo Yue is a very common formula that's used in Shu documents. The usage here is very unusual. It would seem to indicate that Renyun Fu is acting as a regent, or that this is an indication of a later compositional context in which the conventions of using this Ruo Yue are different. So we see this in other chapters, like the Weizi and some other chapters that are believed to be later. But these are relative dating. So is the Renyun Fu text old, authentically old, at least authentic by that sort of standard? It's very difficult to say. And we can say that there are problems with relying on grammar to date the text and some of these other features. And then of course there are problems, of well, I'll get to that in a minute. So despite the pitfalls of working with unprovenant texts like the Qinghua manuscripts, the alternative can be seen to have its own problems. So we need to consider both types of evidence. In contrast, of course, the Jaigong chapter, if we want to ask if that's authentically old, then we can say, yes, if the Tsinghua version is authentic, then it's circulated in the Warring States period, and we can at least say something definite about it. But then again, we have this problem of authentication. So in the matter of Wei Yuan and Zhuang Shuzu and their judgments about sort of critical judgments about where this belongs, how these could be read. What if there were no distinction between leftover and esteemed documents before the Han, as Li Shuijin has said? I don't think these are totally crazy ideas, as Huang Peirong has suggested. Maybe he wasn't talking about this aspect in particular, but one thing we can say, though, is that Shu documents that recount criticisms of the ruler, of a standing Zhou ruler, I should say, tend to end up in the Yizhou Shu, these two texts, or these narratives are set in pre-Zhou antiquity. So might the Renyun Fu and Jaigong chapters have ended up in the Yizhou Shu because of the direct way in which their protagonists speak out against a standing Zhou ruler? Was this unacceptable in some doctrinal or courtly context? I think this is possible. This is sort of an initial idea I have, but it's largely consistent with findings of some others, especially most saliently Sarah Allen, who has shown that very often these excavated texts tend to show a different emphasis of ministerial power. So they emphasize ministerial power over hereditary rule. And this aligns in some ways with that same axis. But it's sort of, we're also dealing with a sort of shunted compilation, perhaps. That these things weren't completely removed, but they were placed somewhere else, or they circulated and somehow ended up in this Yizhou Shu compilation, and not as part of the core. So I'm getting on towards the end here. I'm going to talk about the possibilities of recomposition and what that means. In many texts of the Shangshu, there must be some sort of recreation of Shu texts. So they're not necessarily recording historical records of exact speech. And it isn't plausible that a lot of the pre-Zhou events, so in the Shangshu we have things from the earliest sage kings, the Xia and the Shang dynasty. We don't think that these texts are actually things that were left behind as records, but that they're sort of reenacted or reconstructed from previous dynasties or reimagined, and that these are part of our current Shangshu. Even the Jinwen text contains a number of these. The Tsinghua corpus also presents a number of documents that contain new versions of known texts and texts that may be something that we could call Zhengguwen texts, so authentic old texts. So texts that were later forged or recomposed. The Shoming is one example. Yingao is another possibility. And then just to come back to this question, this text called the Renyun Fu Bi, which is like the musical version of the Renyun Fu chapter. Neither of these, or it can't be the case that both of these are the exact speech of Renyun Fu at the specific event at court when Renyun Fu dressed down King Li, his king, at a certain point in the Zhou dynasty. Unless this happened, this historical event repeated itself many times and generated lots of records. So which one tells it the way the real Uncle Ray said it? The two are unlikely to be both authentic in these senses. And then there's this question of the Renyun Fu Bi. Is it a Shu document? It's found in the Tsinghua corpus with a number of other Shu documents. We don't know enough about the genre of these, genre awareness of these early users to say that these are versions of a different text that could have been composed. But it's also possible that there are many ways in which these narratives were recomposed. And I should say also about just the relationship between the Renyun Fu B and the Ijo Shu Renyun Fu chapter is there is almost nothing repeated or formulaically shared between these. So one is completely recreates the other. So they may not be in the same genre, but there also are a lot of really interesting questions of recompilation and what the relationship is between these. I just want to close now with a quote by the late Li Xueqin. I do not believe, I think that there are other good ways of authenticating the Tsinghua manuscripts. I don't mean to throw shade on Li Xueqin or his historical reconstructions, but I just wanted to share this quote that I find very interesting from a lot of different ways. Because in some ways, Li Xueqin he wrote many years before about a lot of these texts, and some of his predictions turned out to be true. Some of the texts that he wrote about seem to have ended up in his hands in this collection of manuscripts. So Li Xueqin cites the view of Chen Yingke, and he says, regarding the matter of faking of the documents, I've said repeatedly that it is not necessarily the case that the ancients were deceivers trying to deceive us. They were just reordering some materials. They were zhengli, reordering. Well, reordering is the same word that the Tsinghua manuscript editors use for editing materials. First of all, he cites Chen Yingke, so this is not his own view, at least there's some plausible deniability here. There's also this matter of sort of the continuity of reordering texts and the role of state historians, because Li Xueqin was very well supported by the state in his manuscript center and so forth. And then for those who would suspect Li Xueqin of his predictions of being too good to be true, it almost sounds like an apology for some doctoring of history. Now, I'll say again, I don't think that's what this is, but I think for those who doubt, and there are indeed people in the field who express doubts, if not in writing about these materials, this is a topic of conversation. And so I find this very interesting that, maybe this is an apology saying, well, they reordered documents in the past, and I'm taking up what Chen Yingque did or Chen Yingke did, and that's how they did it. That's how we did it then, and this is how we did it now. And it's not really quite sure what goes into that, but if we just leave it at this, and this is how I would like to leave it. Rather than coming back to all the particular forms of authenticity, I think I'll leave the rest for some questions. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for your questions, and to Chris and Anka for organizing this. And that is